As part of our work on the N5, as well as recording what people traditionally think of archaeology, which is the remains of people who lived maybe thousands of years ago, we've also been looking at much more recent heritage. So the remains of the landscapes, the houses and the settlements of people who lived in the much more recent past, so the 18th, 19th and 20th century. Sometimes we refer to this as post-medieval heritage, but another term that's very often used is vernacular. So when we think about vernacular architecture, we're talking about houses that are designed and built within a community without the use of professional architects or professional plans. And vernacular buildings and architecture are very much characterised as being built from locally available materials. They're often very specifically designed to deal with the local climate, the local landscape, the local topography, and local lifeways, so the types of activities people are engaging in, be that sort of farming or fishing or textile production, so sort of those kind of things. On the N5, we've investigated a number of different types of post-medieval vernacular settlements or site types. So I suppose houses would be the most common one. So we've looked at a number of different dwellings dating from the 18th to the 20th century. We've also looked at other ancillary aspects of the landscape. So this would include wells or stiles or field boundaries and paths and the way that people moved around the landscape. Stiles are pedestrian crossings over field boundaries. So it's often like a little step that would be built into maybe a stone wall that enables a person to quickly kind of climb over the wall without having to go through a formal gate. And they have a wide range in date, and there are many stiles still in use today that people use. And they're very interesting because they tell us about the way people move around a landscape. So when we look at the older map, there's often footpaths marked on it. So they tell us about those kind of different ways of moving through the landscape. Running water in houses is a relatively new phenomenon, and before that most people would have gotten their water for their multitude of everyday activities from wells. So some people would have had wells within their own farm settlements or at the end of the roads. Some wells are extremely old, but we also have wells associated with landed estates, maybe where the landlord perhaps is drilling a well to provide access to water for their tenants. We recorded a really interesting well just outside Strokestown, and it has a beautiful limestone cut surround with a number of steps and a beautifully cut arch leading down to the well, which is quite deep down. And this is on the Strokestown domain. It's right beside the road, so it's probably built by the Strokestown estate to provide water for the tenants who could come and access. One of the types of survey that we carried out as part of the works for the N5 is built heritage survey, and this is applied to upstanding buildings, so buildings that are still remaining in the landscape as opposed to archaeological sites which only survive to ground level most of the time. So at these sites what we do is we carry out a survey of the building. So we use measuring tapes and cameras, photography, so we make like a map of the building. So we measure the floor plan, the size of all the rooms, where all the windows are, where the fireplaces are, where the doors are. And that's a really important step for interpreting it, for understanding it. One thing that we've seen a lot in the vernacular buildings we've surveyed on the project is the addition of concrete, often in the 20th century, or the renovations. You might have an original open hearth and then you have a different kind of fireplace that's put in, or it's narrowed. You might have the addition of sinks with running water, the addition of electricity. So we start to see the modernisation of the buildings through time. So many of the buildings that we look at have been sort of abandoned in that they haven't been lived in for quite a long period of time. And so often we find the belongings of the last people who lived in them still there. One of the ways that we've been able to roughly date the last occupation is through calendars. So a number of the buildings have had calendars left up on the wall. Yes, one of the most interesting sites we recorded was a building in the townland of Craigas. It's a beautiful site. It's this kind of big hill on the way between Strokestown and Elphin. And actually the main road from Strokestown and Elphin used to run over the brow of the hill. And then in the 19th century it was moved further down. And we actually archaeologically uncovered part of the original 18th century road as part of the archaeological works. And it's a 4-roomed vernacular farmhouse. And from the outside it looks pretty innocuous. You've got, your corrugated iron roof and your nice little windows. But when we went inside and we realised some of the boards on the ceiling were sort of falling down, and when we got a closer look, we realised the corrugated iron roof was concealing a beautiful thatched roof underneath it. We decided that we would, obviously as part of the work, we had to properly record the roof. So we pulled down all the ceiling boards in the kitchen and we did a scaled drawing of the structure underneath the roof. And then we also carried out a mini archaeological excavation on the roofs. We did a cutting through the layers of thatch, and we took it out layer by layer and assigned context numbers to it, and we had it analysed by an archaeobotanist. The base layer of the roof is made up of roundwoods, so just kind of round branches that have been laid down to form the basic structure. And then we had a layer of scraws, and so that's essentially the top layer of the soils. And it's tied onto the roundwood structure with sugan ropes, or sort of straw ropes. So we had a lot of those surviving. And we could also discern various episodes of fixing and repairing on the inside of the roof. So at some point, some of the roundwoods had been replaced with milled timbers. So you could sort of really see how the building was changing through time and changing priorities. We were able to look at the different layers of peeling wallpaper, in one of the bedrooms, and sort of peel them off layer by layer, and you could see the changes through time. And on the floor, there had been originally been like an earthen floor, and in a couple of the rooms had been replaced with a concrete floor. But we were able to lift up the old lino and see the 1970s newspapers that had been laid down under the lino, and that was a way to date when the lino had been put down. And there was also religious pictures that had been pasted onto the wall. We could see the dates on those. So we were able to kind of use an archaeological approach in which we use the idea of strata and layers, and sort of we try and parse out how those all relate to each other to examine an upstanding building using the exact same approach. So in addition to the built heritage sites, which are largely upstanding buildings in the landscape, we also archaeologically investigate the sites of vernacular buildings that have been since demolished. These kind of buildings are quite different to excavate and record than, say, for example, an upstanding building. So we would take a very different approach. And it's an approach that's much more like traditional archaeology, in that we're physically removing the different layers of the building, trying to reveal back the structure and systematically take it apart, and retrieving artefacts from the remains to try and understand its life history and the history of the building. And again, some of the same questions, how it changed through time. Some of the things that we can do in an archaeological excavation that we couldn't really do in a built heritage survey is to take the walls apart and really look at how they're made, so we can see the structure of the walls. We can dig out the foundations, we can look at how they were put together, we can look at the floors, we can dig through the floors and see if there were multiple episodes of flooring. So for example, one of the sites we looked at was in a place called Corskeagh, and it was a really interesting, really tiny little 2-room building actually built in a bog. But what was really interesting was there was a clay foundation. So we had a foundation of this beautiful yellow clay that had been brought in, obviously as a waterproofing mechanism. We were also able to investigate things like yards and paths and access into the buildings, and a number of the buildings have really nice landscapes around them. So for example, at the site at Cashel, we had a beautiful flag floor inside the building, but it also extended out to the front yard, and the space between the road and the house had these beautiful big flags kind of gradiating into cobbles, creating this lovely yard at the front of the building. This approach allows us to retrieve material, archaeological material from the different layers, and that can help us to date things. So for example, at Corskeagh, we found a coin from the clay floor, and this is helping us to date the construction of the building. In other instances, we might be more reliant on things like clay pipes or pottery or other kinds of artefacts that we find in the buildings. One of my favourite finds on the site was part of a tub of genuine Russian bear grease. We found this in the site of Cashel, and it's actually a type of hair cream, sort of hair gel, probably used by men to sort of slick back their hair. But I thought it was a really nice little fun find from the site. When it comes to the vernacular sites and the excavation of the sites, there are some find types that are really common, and this is perhaps the most common find type, and this is pottery. So the first thing to think about is this arrives at a very specific historical time, and we can think about when people are starting to use this type of material. So we know, for example, that in early modern Ireland, people were using wood as one of their main materials for bowls and plates, and wood still remained really common in rural Ireland until actually quite late. So this type of material is kind of only coming into Irish households, especially rural, kind of small-scale Irish households, really from this early 19th century onwards. If we think of an era before the advent of mass dyes and mass colours, and then you have these kind of objects with this kind of lustrous white fabric and this shiny blue colour, it must have been really kind of special to have it. And it's invented in England in the middle of the 18th century, and it's basically an attempt to emulate Chinese porcelain. This is often called chinoiserie, in that it's sort of Chinese-derived design, and willow pattern was one of the most common examples of that. One of my favourite pieces from this site is this little rim of a platter, and it's very interesting to me because it has this small hole drilled into the side of it. And this tells us that this particular platter was repaired at some point, and they would have been then sewn together using a wire thread to hold the piece of pottery together. A lot of pottery has a function that's to do with its display, and the dresser was a really important part of furniture in the rural Irish household. And even quite poor houses that maybe couldn't afford a dresser would often have a shelf on the wall where they would display pottery. What they kind of come to symbolise is the different kind of social relationships people have. So in a way they're less about a purely functional piece of delf to eat off, and that becomes a part of the life story of the plate, and every time you see that crack or that mend, you're reminded back to that event. I suppose pottery, it's a lot more than just something to eat your dinner off. In addition to the refined earthenwares, this is some of the most common pottery that we find on our vernacular sites, and this is coarse earthenware. So in contrast to the refined earthenware, which is largely made in England, some of it can be made in Ireland as well, this is much more locally produced pottery. And we know in Roscommon in particular, there are a lot of small coarse earthenware potteries around the county, and that's in part due to the availability of really nice clays along the Shannon, which is perfect for making pottery. So this kind of pottery is produced in Ireland during the 18th, 19th and 20th century. Some of the things that would mark this out as different is obviously its form and its fabric. So you can see it's much coarser, it's much bigger. The fabric is, you can see here, it's like a very kind of reddish fabric, but lots of kind of coarse inclusions in the clay. And this is used for quite a different thing than the refined earthenware, which in this type of pottery is largely connected with activities such as dairying. Some of the bigger vessels, they're kind of used for things like settling milk, for making butter. Here we have a selection of clay pipes from the vernacular house we excavated at Gortnacrana. Clay pipes are again one of the really most common finds we get on these site types, and many of you might be familiar with them. Perhaps you have some at home, or they could be something that you dig up in your garden. Clay pipes are in use in Ireland from the early modern period onwards up to about the 20th century. One of the things we love about them is that they can be used to date archaeological layers, and that is because they change through time. The very earliest pipes have quite a small bowl, and the bowl becomes larger through time, and the stem also changes through time. One of the most interesting things about our selection of clay pipes that we've got in Roscommon is the different maker's marks that we found on the pipe. So often on the bowl of the pipe, as in this example, we'll find a stamp from the place where it was made. And Knock Crockery, being quite close to here, was one of the most well-known pipe making places in Ireland. We often get different kinds of iconography on the pipes connecting into contemporary politics of the times. The harp can be read in that vein.